Good morning and welcome to this webinar. Today we are addressing the caring of dry collections. So welcome, and we hope you're going to enjoy it. We hope you're going to find it useful and informative. My name is Furupero Tambani. I'm the Science Communication Officer for the NSCF, and I'm just going to open and go through the intro. Today, the panelist is only Michelle, so she'll be running the show alone. It's a one-woman show today. But before we get to Michelle, we just need to go through the webinar guidelines of engagement. So we would like you to please keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host, as well as other participants. So let's be kind, let's be considerate of each other. You can use the chat box to say hello and let us know which institution you are coming from. You can start with this right away. So if I can just see the people in the chat just greeting, we know that it's our African tradition to get into a space and greet. So let's get that going. And then you can use the Q&A box to add your questions there. So as we go through the webinar, whatever question comes up, even the ones that you came with, you can just put them in the Q&A box and we will try to answer all of them. If we don't get to answering all of them, then we will answer them on the webinar link. And that is on our YouTube channel or on our Facebook page, since we are also live streaming to Facebook. So please do that. You can visit the NSCF website, the page where we have all information about collections management. So if you go to www.nscf.org.za, you go to resources, and then from there you'll find collections management. All previous webinars, discussion forums, and all information about the course are listed there. So please do go there. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Michelle.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much, Fulu, for kicking off for us. So what we're going to be covering today is similar to what we did for the wet collections, but obviously the actual details are quite different when we look at dry collections. We're going to look at the 10 agents of deterioration and see which ones are relevant for dry collections, and then how do we address those agents of deterioration through standards for storage. So we've covered some of this in the storage topic that we did before, but we'll just go through them and focus on the dry collections. And then the big issue for dry collections is obviously pests. And so we'll spend some time looking at pest management and then just summarize the key standards for dry collections. So our focus today is really on the standards and not details of the processes. I think that the types of collections covered under dry collections is quite diverse, and we know that the institutions who are partners in the NSCF are also diverse in terms of their size and how many staff they've got and how they operate. And so the detailed processes we can't go into today, it's just too much. But next week, I'm hoping that we can get some people from the different institutions who work on dry collections to show us how they do different things. So that the more detail will hopefully come in the discussion forum next week. Next slide. So what are we talking about when we talk about dry collections? So there's quite a few invertebrate collections, pinned insects, so that we've got millions and millions of those across the different institutions, mollusk shells, and also some of the marine invertebrates, so dried corals, echinoderm tests, and then for vertebrates, skins for birds and mammals, and then also skeletons and skulls and jaws, tortoise and turtle shells, and then also taxidermy mounts, and then plants. So most of the plant collections, the herbaria, have pressed and mounted plants, so those count as dry collections. They also have seeds and they have wood samples. And then obviously fossils are also dry collections. Right, next slide. And here there are just some more examples, taxidermy mounts there, and corals and rhino skulls, herbarium specimens, bat skins with skulls or something else in little bottles there in the trays. Next slide. Okay, so what are the risks to these collections? So with the wet collections, the big risk was really drying out, but you know, some of these risks are common. So physical forces are probably a bigger risk for the dry collections than they are for the wet collections. And that's because a lot of these specimens are delicate. So dropping them, bumping them, handling them can cause breakage. Disassociation, so this is where you lose the label or separate the label from the material, or other forms of separating the specimen from information. That's obviously always a risk. A big risk for the dry collections compared to the wet ones is the incorrect humidity, and then also incorrect temperature is a risk. Light and UV, pollutants, pests, water, fire. So all of these agents of deterioration are a significant risk. I didn't circle criminals there, although I think some dry specimens are potentially targeted by criminals, but it's not a massive issue for us on a daily basis. Next slide. Okay, so most of these agents of deterioration, if you think about it, they're related to the storage. So how are the specimens stored and where are they stored? So that's the biggest issue, is about storage. Next slide. So you can see the kinds of storage here. In the previous slide, there were boxes, and these are not local collections. These are international. I think one is Smithsonian. They're both Smithsonian, and you can see the types of storage: drawers and cabinets, open shelving, but very clean, well-organized storage areas. Next slide. So if we think about physical forces, so this is breakage of specimens or damage to them, so chipping off. And we think back to when we looked at storage and we looked at these different levels of protection. So you've got your collection object, and then it's got packaging or wrapping around it, and then it's in a container, and then it's in a cabinet, and then it's in a room, and then it's in a building. So each of those levels can provide protection to your specimens in your collection. And you've got to think about how best to protect the specimens from being damaged by using those different levels or layers of enclosure. So if you correctly store things, you can reduce the damage. So lining or padding in boxes or containers, because what you don't want is several specimens in a box, and every time you move the box, the specimens hit against the edges of the box, or they bump into each other and they can damage each other. So lining, padding, thinking about how best to protect the specimens from bumping against edges or against each other is really important. And if you've got drawers and cabinets and the specimens sit directly in those, make sure that the drawers can open and close easily and you're not having to jerk them. And every time you do that, there's jarring on those specimens, and things like wings and legs can fall off, or bones can chip, and very delicate skulls, teeth can fall out. So, do a check to see that you're not causing any physical damage to specimens. Next slide. So also the way you handle specimens is really important. You have to handle specimens when you take them out to study them. Some you have to clean, some you have to move, some you have to package up to send out on loan. And so you've got to always be thinking about how to not cause damage to them, to these very delicate objects. So pinned insects, never hold the actual specimen, never touch that specimen unless it's with forceps. Don't touch it with your fingers. Hold the shaft of the pin. Herbarium sheets, remove the folder from the cabinet and work with it on a flat surface. So never try and pull something out while it's still piled up in the cabinet. Any kind of bending can break the specimens, or break parts of it off. So you can see in the picture there someone working, studying it on a flat surface. It's a little bit tilted, but it's not bent. And then at the Moss Herbarium, they've got these very nice cradles that they work with the herbarium specimens there. So they're not lying flat, but they're not bending. And when you pick up a specimen, hold it by on both edges so that it doesn't bend. And then obviously never lean on specimens, never put a sheet of paper over them and write over them. So just always be aware that these are incredibly fragile objects that are being handled. Next slide. So that's the physical forces, and I think it's just a matter of always being aware that you're working with things that can break very easily. The other aspect is pollutants, the other agent of deterioration, and these pollutants are often from the storage materials, especially if they're in the wrong storage environment. So temperature and humidity can cause problems with the wood or the paper or the padding that you've got. And it's usually okay. So if you've got wooden drawers and wooden cabinets, it's fine if the humidity is consistent and at the right level. And if your temperatures are stable and maintained at the right level, then it's less likely that you'll have release of gases from the wood that can impact on the specimens. So the correct environment is really important. And then obviously any archival, any paper or lining or padding, any drawers or cabinets and shelving should not release gases. So whenever you use anything that's in contact with the specimens, you must make sure that it's archival quality. So that's things like acid-free paper and a proper archival glue for herbarium specimens, or if you're gluing on or fixing anything, it must be the proper material. Otherwise, you do more damage. And then dirt or dust and dirt buildup. So this is a type of pollutant. It would qualify as a pollutant. It hides important features. It's abrasive. It attracts pests. So if you've got thick layers of dust and dirt covering specimens, it's going to cause their deterioration. So no specimen should be left without some form of protective covering. So sealed cabinets, closed drawers, boxes, or some other cover. And that picture on the top there shows a kind of dust cover for open shelving. In one of the previous slides, I showed open shelving at one of the international museums, and those are not covered, but that room is completely sealed. There are no windows. Dust is not going to get in there. So if you've got that kind of room, then it's not that much of a problem. But if you've got windows, if you've got doors, and your ceilings aren't perfectly sealed, then you're going to get dust coming in. So then you need some kind of dust protection for your big specimens that sit on a shelf. Right, so that is also really important. Never leave specimens lying out in the open. So herbarium specimens should be put away. Insect drawers should be closed, never left open. Even, when you're working on a whole lot of insects, you might have them out of their cabinets. But overnight, as soon as you finished working with that drawer, put the lid on. Right, next slide. So the storage environment, so this is what's recommended. The temperature should be stable, and it should be between 16 and 22 degrees for these collections. So it doesn't mean it can fluctuate from 16 to 22. It just means that you select the temperature within that range. It might be 18 degrees and it stays at 18 degrees, whether it's summer or winter or whatever happens. If the temperature is too warm, then if you've got skin collection, they release fats, and then you start getting hair falling out or feather loss. Also, warm temperatures promote pests. Pests love warmth. And if you've got fluctuations in the temperature, if the temperature goes up and down, you're going to get, even though you won't see it, it's very small levels, but it's there. So when it's hot, the specimen expands. Then when it gets cold, it contracts. And you can imagine bone or delicate skulls or mollusk shells or any kind of material that has to constantly go through an expansion and contraction process. Eventually they break, they crack, or it's something called delamination. So they will eventually be lost or deteriorate to such a extent that it can't really be used for research. The relative humidity is also really important when we've got dry collections. So if it's too dry, so people often think that as dry as possible is good, but then specimens can become, they can crack and become too brittle. So shells, horn, bone, teeth, they undergo something called delamination. So they start to shear off in layers and break down the actual composition. Vivarium mouse and pinned insects become so brittle that you can't really work with them properly. So as dry as possible is not always the best approach. But obviously if it's too moist, then you start to get mold that builds up. It can cover and coat specimens, and the mold releases an enzyme that breaks down organic matter. And the mold also damages labels and paper mounts. So eventually, if your specimens become coated in mold, they will be lost. And then there's also this interesting thing called Burdigray. So the top picture of that insect shows this green sort of filaments or hairs covering the specimen. And that's because of copper and brass pins, insect pins, that break down when it's too moist. And they react with fats, and then you get this kind of these crystals forming. And then wooden drawers, they release volatile organic compounds when it's too damp. And there's acid crystalline growth that's corrosive to birds' eggs and mollusk shells. So that's what I was saying. If you've got wooden drawers, then you must have the right temperature and moisture levels. Otherwise, you won't see the pollutants coming out, but they'll be there, they're gases, and eventually it starts to impact. So fluctuations in relative humidity also cause swelling and contraction. As things get damp, they swell. As they dry out, they contract again. And that causes the splitting as well. So these are really important to keep constant. So the humidity should be stable, and it should be moderate. So 50% humidity is usually the best. Anything between 45 and 55 is okay. So how do you know what your relative humidity is? There are data loggers. They're not terribly expensive, and they should be put in the appropriate positions throughout the collection storage room, and they should be checked and monitored, and you can download the data and you can check. And then if there are problems with your climate control equipment, then you can have your air cons checked, serviced, or your humidity, your dehumidifier, or whatever other way of climate control you have. This is probably the most important thing, is your temperature and your humidity, and monitoring them and knowing what they are and intervening when they're wrong. All right, next slide. So water damage is also a big risk to dry specimens. Obviously, if they get wet, they develop mold because it's hard to dry them out. And they break, and lose a lot of their research value. So flooding is the cause of water damage in a lot of cases, and it can be caused by burst pipes, poorly maintained drainage systems, inappropriate building structure. So it might be in a basement where there's a big risk of flooding all the time. And maybe even if you've got the wrong fire suppression system. So if you have sprinklers and they go off by accident and they drop a whole lot of water on your collections, that can cause cabinets, shelving, and objects to become waterlogged. So it's important to do a proper risk assessment for flooding potential and to know, like, is there a risk? Do you have water pipes running across the ceiling? Do you have water sprinklers in that area? Do you have stormwater drains running outside? Are you in a basement? Is there any other, are there leaks in the ceiling? So to know exactly what the risks are, and then to try and mitigate those that you can. It might be clearing of stormwater drains, it might be repairing of roof leaks. And then a big lesson that we've learned, and I think Dean from Burles told us about the importance of having the cabinets raised off of the ground. So if they sit flat on the ground and there's a flood from putting out a fire or just from flooding, your specimens are going to get wet. The water is going to rise up in your cabinet. So they must be raised off the ground. At least 10 centimeters, but a bit better is obviously more helpful. And no object should be stored directly at floor level or sit on the floor. And I know that that's a problem for big skulls or big heavy specimens, bones and things, but they do also need to be put on some kind of platform off the ground. Yeah, so as we've said already, wooden cabinets, wooden shelves are a problem if they get wet. They swell and they also release gas. So metal cabinets are far better. But the important thing is to have your disaster plan in place. So in previous topics, we've talked about the disaster management plan, and that should be in place, and you should be prepared if there is a flood, especially if your building or that room is prone to flooding. You should have all your plans of what to do if there's a flood, have your salvage materials available. Everybody should know what they need to do, and you should know who you're going to call to come and take specimens to dry them, or how would you deal with specimens that got wet. Next slide. Okay, light and UV, I think, is far bigger problem for dry collections than it is for wet collections. The light, if you have light shining on specimens, it causes fading of pigments in skins, on insects, mollusk shells, and herbarium specimens. So they lose their pigments, and that is a problem for studying them. So I've just put some pictures here, and you can see that poor cheetah who's been on display somewhere for a very long time. He doesn't even look like a cheetah anymore because his color has faded. And then the specimens at the bottom, those two moths, I think, or maybe they're butterflies, they're the same species. The one has just been exposed to light and the other one hasn't. And you can see that all those important colors and color patterns are gone from exposure to the light. And then you can see some text, some writing there as well. And you can see the picture on the right shows what you can see under a particular kind of light. But the one on the left, you can see that's been lost through fading. So you lose a lot of the research value, and you can lose all the information if all the text on the labels is lost. So specimens must be kept in a dark room all the time, or in closed cabinets all the time if the room is not dark. So sometimes they are, like, if well-sealed dark cabinets are fine, but if your specimens are not in cabinets, then the room must be kept dark with blinds, or whatever other mechanism you can use. Next slide. Fire is obviously a massive risk for dry collections. Herbarium collections, it's paper and dried organic matter, and that is a big risk. The others, you know, if you think about a fire through an insect collection, unless it was well protected in metal cabinets and metal drawers, it could also go. So fire detection systems are very important, and then having the proper kind of fire suppression system. So gas will work best. Water is obviously not recommended, although it may be better than nothing. And then also, as usual, fire doors at the entrance to the storeroom, and having regular checks and maintenance. And if you've got fire extinguishers, check that they are the right kind for paper or for dried organic matter. Wooden cabinets and shelves will burn, and so that's why metal is recommended. And I know that there has been, when the working group was looking at this, there were some arguments that metal buckles, if it gets too hot, and that could be more of a problem. And a lot of the woods are very hard woods and they burn very slowly. It may be true, but it seems like the metal is recommended. Don't keep any empty boxes, papers, or other consumables stored in the corridors or in the collection storeroom. So that's just a fire hazard. And then again, have your disaster management in place, knowing what would you do if there is a fire? What would you do if that fire came through that collection? How would you salvage? And who would be responsible? And what materials do you need? And have you got them available? So prepare for fire. Next slide. So disassociation, so there's no link between the specimen and the information about it. I don't think that the labeling is as big a challenge with the dry specimens as it is with the wet collections. The labels can fade and become illegible, and they can become separated from specimens. So just be aware of that. The challenges will come with these very small, delicate skulls, like this bat skull. And you'll also have a lower jaw that also you will always need to be able to associate to the top part of the skull. You can write the number on the skull, the catalog number or accession number, but it's so delicate. So I don't think that there's major problems, but just be careful and do regular checks, especially with the mammal skins, that those strings don't deteriorate and the label becomes loose from the specimen. Next slide. So this is the big issue with dry collections. I said temperature and humidity, but it's linked to pests in a lot of ways. So this figure comes from a USA study. So 54% of collections have reported pest damage. So that's half of the collections. So it's a very common problem. And then you think about if you've got a pest and it's got into one of your specimens, the impact is going to be high, and the pests can spread through the whole collection very quickly. And so this is a massive risk, probably one of the biggest risks in terms of losing the entire collection very quickly. So pests damage and destroy pinned insects. They damage and destroy skins, mammal skins, bird skins, bones, and herbarium specimens. I don't think that they do much damage to fossils. But they also damage the storage material. So wooden shelves, wooden cabinets, wooden floors, paper and boxes can also be destroyed by pests. So it's not only the collections, it's everything around them. Next slide. So I think that any of you who've worked in a herbarium or an entomology collection, or you've had books, will just know the feeling of opening something and seeing this kind of thing. It's happened to me, makes your stomach turn. It's just terrible. So you can not be aware that you've got a pest infestation, and you know, within a few weeks, the pests will just completely demolish an insect, a pinned insect, or a herbarium specimen. And you can see signs of the pests in the beetle in the corner there. There's some casings there. And then at the bottom on the right is also those like little telltale signs of pests. And these slides are from, some of them are from a website called How to Protect My Mounted Specimen, Insect Specimens from Insects. So it was an amateur who found that their insect collection was being eaten. Okay, next slide. So what are the pests in collections? I think some of you will know them quite well. You look for them all the time. But the most common ones are beetles, carpet beetles, cigarette beetles, domestic beetles, and then moths, especially these clothes moths or case moths they call. And it's not usually the adults that are the problem, it's the larval stages that feed on dead organic matter, feathers, skin, dead dried skins, and dead plant matter. So anything dry, they get in there and they eat it. Those are, I'm not going to go through all the individual kinds, but those are really the main culprits. Next slide. And then the other pests, so these are not the main ones that will eat your collection, but they can cause a lot of damage in storerooms and with papers. So rats, book lice, which are tiny little things that are usually an indicator of moisture, and they can get into your books and papers, but also onto the specimens. And then cockroaches, they just cause a mess, especially on paper and books. And if they get into the collection, they will also cause damage. And then termites can eat all your furniture and your floorboards. If you've got wooden floors, they can eat cabinets. I mean, they're just incredible. You won't even see them until it's too late. And you touch something and the whole structure just collapses. They've eaten all the structure inside and all that's left is the outside. So if any of you have ever had termites in your house, you will have seen the incredible destruction that they can cause. And then fish moths, well, I call them fish moths. The entomologists have probably got another name for them, but they also get into paper and eat it in fine layers. So all of these things are also pests. Next slide. So if you want to identify what pest is in your collection, there are incredible resources on the internet, and there's this poster that you can access. You can find it on the internet, and it gives you a breakdown. It's got pictures, so for wood and furniture, fur and feathers and hide, and fabric and textiles, and then scavengers. So that's a very useful resource. Next slide. There's also this website, museumpests.net. So this is a whole working group, and they've got different fact sheets, how to identify different pests. And it doesn't matter that it's American, it's the same kind of group of different pests. So that's very useful. They've got an image library there. Next slide. There's also this website, Introduction to Museum Pests. It's an e-learning tool. And then section 2 there, you can see moths, beetles, rodents, other insects and animals. So you can learn how to identify the different pests. Next slide. And then this website called What's Eating Your Collection. And they've also got identification guides and pictures of all the different kinds of pests in collection. So that's also very useful. Next slide. And then these two documents, one is a book, the one on the right is a book, which has got a lot of detailed information. The one on the left, Identifying Insect Pests in Museums and Heritage Buildings. That's a guide, and it's available on the internet, and it's got incredible information in it if you're trying to identify pests. I'd really recommend that one from the Natural History Museum. Very, very useful. Next slide. So where do these pests come from? You know, you can say, but we fumigated. Where did the pests come from? So birds, if you've got birds nesting on your windowsills, and I think every building that I've ever worked in has had pigeons who set up their home outside the window and make scrappy nests, and the feces all accumulate. That's a great source of pests. And then if you've got old bags of rubbish and waste paper and waste boxes and broken furniture and bits of carpet, that's pests will find their way in to live there. And any clutter, stuff that comes into the storeroom, people bringing bags in, foodstuffs, you know, pests can travel with that. I think the biggest risk, though, is for material coming from either from the field or coming from another institution where it's infected and it brings those pests into your institution. So you really have to be careful about that. But the more clutter and the more mess and the more dirt, the more pests you're going to have. Next slide. So in the past, I mean, pests in collections have always been a problem, but in the past, the approach was to just use as much poison as you possibly could to kill every possible pest in that collection. And there were things like DDT, arsenic, mercuric chloride, and various other toxins. And then later, people used Vaporona, so that's Chlorovos. So those cupboard strips of that yellow stuff, you cut them up into little blocks and put them into your insect drawers and put them in with the skins. Also mothballs, naphthalene, and camphor as well. So camphor crystals were used in the collections. Most institutions are moving away from those things because of the health risks, but there's still some use of methyl bromide, and there's still some use of foggers, doom foggers, which are a pyrethroid, and fumitab, so that's a deltamethrin. So, you know, there's still a variety of different pesticides being used and different approaches. And something to remember is that all old collections will have residues of pesticides. In most cases, it doesn't go away. Those old chemicals stick around, they hang around on those specimens for years and years. And if there are no accurate records of what was used in the past, don't assume that there was nothing, assume that there was something toxic used, and handle those specimens with care. So you should really use gloves when you're handling specimens that might have had arsenic or mercury or other heavy metals as fumigants. But globally, I think now most institutions are recognizing that fumigants, any kind of fumigants, has a negative impact on the specimens. So it alters the chemical composition of them. So it's not harmless to the specimens. It can cause changes in them. And then they're also recognizing that insects develop resistance to fumigants or pesticides. So you fumigate and it doesn't have a massive impact on the insects. And then many fumigants are not fully effective for collections. They only kill the active stages. They don't kill the eggs that are sitting either in a pinned insect or in dried tissue. And, you know, they're useful. So fumigants are useful for general building fumigation, but for actually dealing with collections, it's not that useful. And then, of course, there are massive health risks to people, but there are also environmental risks of using a lot of toxins. So you think about methyl bromide, which they've now found has a negative impact on the ozone layer and contributes to climate change. There's others, and think about the containers and the waste containers from those poisons that then, where do they go? So globally, people are starting to move away from the traditional approach. Next slide. And the big new thinking, well, it's not even that new, it's actually quite old, but more and more collection institutions are getting on board with this, and that's integrated pest management. So it's a concept that's been used a lot in agriculture and the agricultural industry, where they've also recognized that just spraying everything with poison is not the best way forward. So with integrated pest management, you manage the pests. The first step is to prevent and avoid. So prevent entry to storerooms by pests. making sure your windows are closed and well sealed, and your doors are also well sealed. And you might need something at the bottom of the door to prevent pests coming under the door. There should be no cracks in the doors or cracks in the walls or cracks in the ceilings, and there should be very well sealed drawers and cabinets that are kept closed, so you can prevent pests getting into your collection. And then also just avoid conditions that promote pests. So as I've said, clutter, dirt, damp, warmth, food, birds' nests, overgrown vegetation on buildings. So all of that promotes pests. And if you get rid of all of that, you remove a lot of the risk. And then just good housekeeping. So regular vacuuming. Vacuuming will pick up little eggs and pests, but it must be one of these special HEPA filters that prevents spreading of mold spores or dust or eggs. And then something, and I distinctly remember when I worked at a museum that we did use feather dusters. And of course, those feather dusters are terrible for spreading pests from one room to another. So never have feather dusters in the storerooms. Don't have carpets in the storerooms because those are very hard to make sure that you've got all the eggs or larvae or pests out of. Don't keep live plants or animals in your storeroom. Don't keep packaging material. Don't keep your field equipment in your storeroom. So it's keeping it as sterile as possible where your collections are stored. And then obviously temperature and humidity control, and treating all incoming material before it goes into the collection storage area. So it must not go anywhere near your collection before it's been treated properly. Next slide. And then the next step for integrated pest management is monitoring and inspection. So these insect sticky traps are really useful. So you put them in wherever you think is going to be a good place. They don't get rid of the insects, the pests, but you can use them to monitor the presence of pests. They need to be put in the right places, and they need to be checked regularly. And then you also you can't only use these, you have to do inspections of your collection. So globally, it's recommended that you do it quarterly, but at least every 6 months. You go through your whole insect collection, carefully check every drawer, or you go through every cabinet in your herbarium and you check for signs of insects. And make sure you do it properly. You must have a good light. You must have a magnifying glass or whatever else works for you, but it's not just a quick 10-second look in a cabinet and then move on. So look properly. If you find any pests, then you must identify them and you must record all your findings, any infestations. So what do you do when you find a little insect case or one of those shells of a little beetle larvae? You've got to record it. You've got to record where it was, how many there were, and what action you took. So everything must be documented. Next slide. And then what do you do when you find signs of pest infestations? So this varies, and it'll depend on how widespread that infestation is. It will depend on the type of collection. It will depend on the resources you've got. So you can, if it just seems to be in one cabinet or one drawer, then you can use freezing for the material from that drawer or cabinet. And the recommendation is if it's a -18 freezer, then it's 2 weeks. If it's a -40 or lower freezer, it's 3 to 5 days. So you've got to be careful. Don't just dump the specimens in there. They're going to absorb moisture in the freezer, so they have to be put very carefully into plastic bags before being put in the freezer. And also remember, you might need to repeat that. So you might need to put them in the freezer, take them out, let them thaw to room temperature, and then put them back into the freezer again. So just also remember that freezing isn't appropriate for everything, check very carefully before you make a decision to freeze. And I'm hoping that people who regularly do freezing of specimens will share with us next week in the discussion forum how they do that. In the manual, there's also this anoxic treatment. So this is globally, they use this. I don't know whether any of our institutions have facilities, but it's basically where you make sure that the space where you put your collection has no oxygen, and you leave it there for 21 days. But you need some kind of a chamber that's very well sealed, and then you need a way of extracting all the oxygen from there. So it's not that easy. If none of these options will work, then you may need to do fumigation, and it's recommended that it's done by a professional service provider, and that you do the research on what will be best, what will have least impact on the specimens, and what will have least risk to the health of staff. I don't know what's currently being used. Methyl bromide is now banned. I think you have to get special permission to use methyl bromide. I know the herbaria swore that it was the only thing that would ever work for them. I've seen a recent notice from the Department of Agriculture that they have to approve every event of it being used. And then there's something called sulfuryl fluoride that seems to have replaced methyl bromide, at least in agriculture. I don't know if it's being used by the companies that do fumigation. Be very interested to find out, and maybe somebody can bring us some information to the discussion forum next week about what's happening with methyl bromide and what can you use in herbaria. There's also use of gases, which seems to work well, nitrogen, CO2, and argon, and they don't have a negative impact on specimens, so they say, but it requires that the area is completely sealed, so it has to have no way of those gases escaping. So this is probably an area of work that still needs lots of thought and discussion and investigation. There's no one answer for everybody, and it's still something that is tricky. Once you've done the treatment for any specimens that were infected, then you've got to keep monitoring them just to make sure that you have actually solved the problem. Next slide. So for this approach of integrated pest management to work, you have to have a documented plan. So it means that you have to be very rigorous about implementing it. So you must have a plan with activities or actions. You must say who is responsible for them, and then a schedule of what needs to be done when. And you have to implement that plan. And there must be documented records of everything that is done and everything that is found. So even if you found nothing, you must document it. And then a really important aspect is that everyone who works in the collections, everyone who works in that collection storeroom, whether it's a cleaner who does the vacuuming, who does the cleaning of specimens, research technicians, researchers, must all have some training in identifying pests. So those people who sweep or vacuum are often the people who will be the ones who have the opportunity to see pests. And they should know what those are, and they should know what to do when they see them. They must report them to somebody. And using that resource is really important. The same with researchers. If they're visitors and they're from outside your institution, perhaps just tell them, if you're working on the collection and you see any kind of trace of pest, please notify whoever and check with them that they would know what to recognize. So it has to be a plan that's implemented, and everybody is aware of that plan, and everybody knows about something about pests. Right, next slide. And then this slide is about mold, but mold can also be considered as a type of pest. It's a fungus, and it's caused by germination of airborne spores, so microscopic little fungal spores that often get into damp places, and they germinate, and then you get this woolly green or gray stuff growing all over your specimens, on your walls, on your books. And the treatment is usually to seal a specimen in a polyethylene bag or enclose it in sheeting if it's very big, to prevent the spread of spores. So remember that there'll be spores in that mold, and if you disturb it, if you try and just brush it off, those spores are going to be released and spread. So the first thing is to try and enclose that specimen, close off that mold, and then put it into an isolated place and lower the humidity using a dehumidifier, or you can also air dry it properly at temperature between 30 and 40. You can try freeze drying if you've got that kind of facility, or you can put it in the sun. Sunlight does kill many of the spores. But first do some research. So just check for whatever kind of material you've got, what is the best way to get rid of mold. Right, next slide. Okay, so those are the big issues that affect dry collections. There may be collection type specific issues, but that's more or less an overview. So just a summary of the standards. So remember, collection storeroom must be sound structure with no leak or damp. Must be well sealed windows and doors. It must be dark, or your material must be dark, kept in the dark. There must be good fire detection and suppression systems. And you must have no materials other than the collection stored or housed in the collection storeroom, because of it just introduces a whole lot of risks. And then that area must be kept very, very clean. Climate control, so you must have humidity between 45 and 55%, temperature between 16, could really go down as low as 16 to 20, 22. You've got to monitor your temperature and humidity and make sure that it's stable, that it doesn't bounce all over the place. There should be metal shelves and cabinets, but we do accept that in a lot of the collections, there are most of the cabinets, drawers, and shelving are wood, and it would be a massive issue to change that quickly. So if you keep your environment correct, then the wooden cabinets and shelves and drawers are not that big a problem. Make sure that your cabinets are well sealed to protect specimens from dust. Make sure that you use all archival quality materials, so that's paper, padding, boxes, glues, pins, and don't put anything directly onto the floor. And then have your pest management system, like we've said. Preferably use a pest management system rather than just having regular fumigation with very heavy poisons. So those are the standards. And if you do that, you should be able to protect your collection and make sure that it can be used for research for hundreds of years to come. So thank you. That's the end of the webinar. I just want to go to the next slide. So as I said, next week we're going to have the discussion forum. And I haven't approached people yet. I'm asking for volunteers. And if I don't get any, then I will just ask people, because I know a lot of people who work in the collection have hands-on experience. You're the people who do the monitoring of the temperature and humidity. You're the people who do checks and monitor pests. You're the people who do the hands-on work and handle the specimen. So we would love to hear from you. It doesn't have to be much. 3 to 5 slides is perfect. We'll put it all together and share our experiences, share stories of pest outbreaks and what did you do about them. Remember, this is nothing to hide. Everybody has pest outbreaks. So how are people dealing with these pest outbreaks? Have you had challenges with your storage? Have you upgraded anything, and what would you like to have? So it can be anything about dry collection, curation, and management and caring for these. So if you'd like to do 3 to 5 slides, please let me know. You can just drop me an email and say, I want to do something on this, and we'll put it all together. And if I don't get enough, then I'm going to identify people and ask them to contribute. But I'd prefer that people volunteer. Okay, so thank you very much. We've come to the end of the presentation, and yeah, just to say thank you very much to everybody for joining us, and we hope you'll join us next week as well. Bye.